In 1990, a young flight attendant vanished during a routine layover, leaving behind only questions and a grieving family now, 19 years later. Her bright red uniform is discovered in an abandoned hangar, unlocking a trail of hidden logs, vanished flights, and long-buried secrets that reveal the dark truth of what really happened that night. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the airport tarmac slick and glistening under the pale morning light. Inside a long-forgotten hangar at the far edge of the field, two maintenance workers were hauling out rusted crates and broken scaffolding, their breath hanging in the cold air. The hangar had been locked for over a decade, its ownership tangled in the collapse of a small charter airline that once operated there. Dust coated every surface, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. One of the workers shifted a stack of warped plywood and spotted a corner of faded canvas wedged behind a wall of crates. At first he thought it was a tarp, but when he pulled it free, he found himself holding a garment bag, its zipper stiff with age. He set it down on a workbench, brushing away years of dust until the faint logo of a long-defunct airline emerged. Curiosity got the better of him. The zipper creaked as it opened, revealing a neatly folded bright red vintage 1990s flight attendant uniform, its matching scarf still tucked into the collar. Pinned to the lapel was an airline badge, the photograph faded but unmistakable. The name printed below was clear: Elaine Warren. For a moment, neither man spoke. The name rang a distant bell, an echo from old news reports. Elaine Warren had vanished in 1990 during a layover in Denver. She was 27 years old, last seen leaving her hotel late in the evening. No one had heard from her again. The uniform was pristine, as if it had been placed there deliberately and never touched since. Beneath it, a pair of polished black heels lay side by side, their shine dulled by a fine layer of dust. The discovery was unsettling in its precision. Like a time capsule no one had intended to find. By the time airport security arrived, word was already spreading. The uniform was carefully sealed in an evidence bag, the badge photographed from every angle. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, streaks of gold breaking through the clouds. But inside the hangar, a different kind of storm had begun. For 19 years, Elaine Warren's disappearance had been a cold case with no answers. Now, in the quiet corner of an abandoned building, a piece of her life had resurfaced, and with it, questions that could no longer be ignored. Mark Halstead was halfway through his second cup of coffee when the call came in. The voice on the other end belonged to an old airport contact, someone he had not spoken to in years. The man's tone was low and deliberate as he explained that a garment bag had been found in a long-abandoned hangar. A name had been on the badge. Mark felt the air leave his lungs when he heard it. Elaine Warren. He leaned back in his chair, the newsroom around him humming with the usual morning clatter of keyboards and phones. 19 years ago, Mark had been a young reporter fresh out of college, eager to prove himself. Elaine's disappearance had been his first major assignment, and it had ended with frustration and regret. Leads had dried up within weeks, and the story faded into the archives. He had always carried the weight of that unsolved case like an unfinished sentence. Now, someone had pulled that sentence back into the light. Mark closed his notebook, grabbed his coat, and drove straight to the airport. The hangar sat at the farthest edge of the property, away from the hum of the terminals. Its corrugated metal siding was streaked with rust, the padlock on the front door freshly cut. Inside, the space was cavernous and dim, with the sharp scent of oil hanging in the air. The uniform was already gone, sealed in evidence bags, and transported to the county forensics lab. Still, Mark walked to the spot where it had been found. A faint outline in the dust marked where the garment bag had rested. He imagined Elaine's red uniform folded carefully inside, untouched for nearly 2 decades. He pictured the person who had placed it there, calm, deliberate, confident. No one would ever stumble across it. A detective Mark recognized from his early reporting days stepped out from behind a row of crates. "I figured you'd show up," he said, not unkindly. "It's evidence now, Halstead, but it's also a question. Why here? Why now?" Mark didn't answer. He was thinking of Elaine's smile in the old crew photo, her hand resting lightly on her flight bag. She had been alive somewhere between that photo and the night she vanished, and this hangar might hold the key to every missing piece in between. The county forensics lab sat on the outskirts of the city, a low, unassuming building that gave nothing away about the work happening inside. Mark waited in the lobby, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, until Detective Harris appeared with a manila folder tucked under his arm. They stepped into a small conference room where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Harris set the folder on the table and flipped it open. Inside were photographs of the uniform, each taken from multiple angles. The bright red fabric looked almost new under the controlled lighting, the scarf still neatly knotted, the airline badge pinned precisely to the lapel. Harris tapped the photo of the badge. "This is the original from 1990. No sign it was ever replaced. It hasn't been worn since the night she disappeared." Mark studied the images, noticing details that were easy to miss in person. The fabric near the right cuff was slightly darker, a faint stain that testing had confirmed was blood. There wasn't enough to get a complete DNA profile, but it was human, and the age of the blood aligned with the timeline of Elaine's disappearance. Next, Harris slid over a close-up of the heels found inside the garment bag. The soles showed almost no wear, as if they had been cleaned or had barely been used. "Whoever put this together wanted it preserved," Harris said. "This isn't how you dispose of evidence. This is how you store it." Mark leaned back, thinking of the abandoned hangar. "Which means they thought they might need it again." Harris didn't disagree. "We're looking into the history of the hangar. The lease records are a mess, but we know a defunct charter company operated out of it until the mid-90s. That's our next step." Mark could feel the story pulling him in, the same way it had 19 years earlier. Only now, the pieces were sharper, the shadows darker. Elaine's uniform was no longer just a relic of her job, it was a message left behind, deliberately hidden, waiting for the right set of eyes to find it. As Harris gathered the photos, Mark realized the most unsettling truth so far. Someone had carried that uniform into the hangar all those years ago, sealed it away, and walked out knowing it would stay undiscovered. Whoever that person was, they were still out there. And they might know exactly who was looking for them now. The morning air at the small regional airport carried a faint tang of jet fuel as Mark made his way toward the administration building. Harris had arranged for him to meet with an archivist who managed decades of property and lease records. Inside, the office was lined with tall metal filing cabinets, their drawers labeled with fading stickers. The archivist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, was already pulling files from a stack. "These are the hangar leases from the late 80s through the mid-90s, he said, laying them on a long table. The papers smelled faintly of dust and old paper glue. Mark flipped through the contracts, each bearing neat typewritten names and signatures. Most were standard agreements, but one caught his attention. In 1989, the hangar had been leased to Skylink Charter Services, a company that dissolved in 1996 after a series of financial disputes. The signature on the lease belonged to Raymond Kerr, a name Mark recognized from an old incident report. Kerr had been a pilot with a reputation for cutting corners, both in business and in his personal life. Elaine had filed an internal complaint against him just weeks before she vanished, citing repeated unwanted advances during flights. The complaint had been quietly dismissed. Mark traced a finger over the faded ink, thinking of the uniform hidden behind crates in a hangar Kerr once controlled. It was too neat to be coincidence. Harris, standing beside him, seemed to share the same thought. Kerr moved out of state in '91, officially retired from aviation. We're tracking where he went, but records are spotty. As they left the office, Mark glanced out toward the runways shimmering in the afternoon light. Planes lifted into the sky with the same effortless rhythm Elaine would have known by heart. The thought of her standing in her bright red uniform, waiting to board, collided with the image of that same uniform folded away in the dark. The hangar had been sealed for more than a decade, but Kerr's connection to it was undeniable. If he had put that uniform there, he had done so with a purpose. The question was whether that purpose was to hide a crime or to keep a reminder close at hand, locked away where no one would think to look. Either answer carried the same chilling implication. Someone had kept Elaine's memory alive in the most unsettling way possible. Mark drove north along the highway, the flat stretch of road giving way to rolling fields and scattered farmhouses. He had managed to track down someone who had worked under Skylink Charter Services during its final years, a retired mechanic named Tom Riley. Tom had agreed to meet him at a diner just outside the small town where he now lived. The diner smelled of frying bacon and fresh coffee, its vinyl booths faded from years of sun through the big front windows. Tom was already seated in the corner, a heavy-set man with weathered hands and eyes that flickered with caution when Mark introduced himself. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured for Mark to sit. "You're asking about Kerr," Tom said, his voice low. "And about that hangar." I knew both. He stirred his coffee slowly, as if weighing how much to say. Kerr wasn't just running a charter service. He had side deals going, late-night flights, no questions asked. Sometimes the cargo was legit, sometimes, well, you didn't want to know. Mark leaned in, careful not to push too hard. "Did you ever see Elaine Warren?" Tom's brow furrowed. "Yeah, a few times. She was friendly, professional, always had a smile for the crew. But I remember one night, this would have been right before she disappeared. I saw her in the hangar. She was talking to Kerr, and she didn't look happy. There was shouting, muffled by the engine noise. Then she walked toward the offices, and I didn't see her again." The words seemed to hang between them, heavy and unshakable. Mark asked if Tom had reported it. Tom shook his head slowly. "Back then, you didn't cross Kerr. People who did found themselves out of work, or worse." Mark paid for the coffee and stepped outside, the wind sharp against his face. The image of Elaine in that hangar, caught in a heated exchange with Kerr, refused to leave his mind. It wasn't proof, but it was the first living thread tying her disappearance directly to the man who once controlled that space. As he started the car, Mark knew that finding Kerr would be more than a matter of digging through old records. If the man had been willing to silence someone like Elaine, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to keep the truth buried now. The address Harris turned up for Raymond Kerr was a weather-beaten ranch house outside Amarillo, Texas. Mark made the trip alone, the drive a long stretch of open road flanked by dry grasslands and the occasional windmill. By the time he pulled into the gravel driveway, the late afternoon sun had turned the sky a deep amber. The house looked tired, with peeling paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A rusted pickup sat under a carport, its windshield coated in dust thick enough to write on. Mark knocked, and after a long pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man in his 70s with sharp eyes that hadn't dulled with age. "Kerr?" Mark asked. The man didn't answer right away, just studied him with a guarded expression. Finally, he nodded. "You're not selling anything, so what is it you want?" Mark introduced himself as a journalist investigating Elaine Warren's disappearance. At the mention of her name, Kerr's jaw tightened. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him as if to block Mark from seeing inside. "I don't know what you think you're going to find digging all that up," Kerr said. "That was a long time ago." "Her uniform was found," Mark replied, watching Kerr's reaction closely. "In the old Skylink hangar. Folded, preserved." For the briefest moment, something flickered in Kerr's expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Don't know anything about that," he said flatly. Mark could feel the wall going up, the kind that years of secrecy built high and solid. He asked if Kerr remembered seeing Elaine the night she disappeared. Kerr's gaze shifted toward the horizon. "People come and go. Can't keep track of everyone." The conversation ended there. Kerr retreated inside without another word, leaving Mark standing on the porch in the cooling evening air. As he walked back to his car, Mark turned the exchange over in his mind. Kerr's denial had been too quick, too neat, and the flash in his eyes when the uniform was mentioned was impossible to ignore. Kerr knew more than he was willing to admit, and if the uniform had rattled him, it meant its discovery had reached exactly the person it was never meant to find again. Mark spent the night in a small roadside motel, the kind where the air conditioner rattled and the parking lot lights never quite shut out the darkness. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his conversation with Kerr. Every clipped word, every sideways glance seemed to carry weight. The man had not been indifferent, he had been wary. That wariness told Mark there was something worth guarding. By morning, he had decided to take a different approach. Rather than press Kerr directly, he would see what the man's neighbors remembered. In a town this size, people noticed things, even if they didn't think to mention them at the time. At a small feed store on the edge of town, Mark struck up a conversation with the owner, a woman in her 60s with a quick smile and a sharper memory. When he mentioned Kerr, her expression shifted. "Keeps to himself," she said, stocking a shelf with sacks of grain. "But I've seen people coming by late at night. Not many, but enough to notice. Same black sedan every time." Mark's pulse quickened. "Recently?" She nodded. "Last month. Twice that I saw. Thought it was strange for a man who says he doesn't travel much." That detail lodged in Mark's mind as he left the store. If Kerr was still meeting with people under the cover of darkness, then whatever had happened in 1990 might not be as far in the past as Kerr liked to claim. It also meant there could be someone else who knew what happened to Elaine. Later that day, Mark parked on a dirt road with a clear view of Kerr's driveway. The hours dragged, the sun slipping toward the horizon. Just when he was thinking of calling it a night, headlights appeared in the distance. A black sedan rolled up the driveway and stopped in front of Kerr's porch. Mark couldn't see much in the fading light, but he caught a glimpse of a tall man stepping out of the car, carrying a narrow case. Kerr met him at the door, and the two disappeared inside without a word. Mark's instincts sharpened. Whatever was in that case, whatever business these two had, it was tied to a secret Kerr had been guarding for nearly 2 decades. And now, for the first time, Mark had the sense that the secret might be about to move. Mark sat in the car with the engine off, the only sound the ticking of cooling metal as the night air settled in. The porch light of Kerr's house cast a weak yellow glow, barely reaching the gravel drive. He could still see the black sedan parked there, its polished surface catching the light in thin, cold streaks. He debated whether to get closer, to try to catch a glimpse through a window, but the openness of the property made it too risky. Any movement would stand out in the dark. Instead, he settled into the driver's seat, notebook in hand, and began jotting down every detail he could see. The man with the narrow case had not reappeared. An hour passed, then another. The silence was broken only by the occasional chirp of insects and the distant hum of a highway. Finally, the front door opened. Kerr stepped out first, his posture stiff, his head turning slightly as if scanning the road. The man from the sedan followed, now without the case. He shook Kerr's hand, exchanged a few short words, and returned to his car. The sedan's headlights swept across the yard before disappearing down the road. Mark waited until both men were gone from sight before starting his own car. He followed at a careful distance, his headlights dimmed. The sedan wound through the quiet streets of town before merging onto the highway, heading east. Mark stayed with it for several miles, but when the car took an abrupt exit into a maze of industrial warehouses, he decided not to push his luck. Instead, he circled back to the main road, filing the location away for later. Back in his motel room, he spread out his notes on the small desk. The narrow case, the late-night meeting, the fact that Kerr had allowed someone into his home after so bluntly shutting Mark out all of it, pointed to something current, not just an old crime buried in the past. If Kerr was still moving pieces around, it might mean Elaine's disappearance was tied to a larger network, one that had never stopped operating. The uniform in the hangar was no longer just a relic. It might have been a warning or a signal, and whoever the black sedan belonged to could very well be the person who knew exactly what that signal meant. The following morning, Mark drove to the industrial district where the black sedan had disappeared. The place had the hollow quiet of somewhere that had seen better days, rows of weathered warehouses, their loading docks empty, paint peeling from metal siding. Trucks passed occasionally, but most of the buildings looked abandoned or barely used. He parked a block away from the street the sedan had taken and continued on foot. The air smelled faintly of machine oil and dust. About halfway down the road, he spotted an older warehouse with a chain-link fence around it, the gate hanging slightly open. A small security camera was mounted above the door, but the lens looked fogged with grime. Mark's pulse quickened when he saw fresh tire marks in the gravel leading from the gate to a side entrance. He walked past casually, pretending to check his phone, but caught a glimpse through a broken window pane. Inside, the space was dim and cluttered, with stacks of unmarked crates pushed against the far wall. In the middle of the floor stood a metal table, and on it a narrow case exactly like the one the man had carried into Kerr's house the night before. He didn't linger. It was the kind of place where standing still for too long would draw the wrong kind of attention. Back in his car, he called Harris and explained what he had found. Harris listened carefully, then told him to stay away from the warehouse for now. "We need a warrant before we can touch anything," he said. "If you get caught snooping, it'll spook them, and we'll lose our shot." Mark understood, but frustration prickled at him. The case was right there, close enough to touch, and inside it could be anything: documents, photographs, even physical evidence that tied Kerr directly to Elaine. Every instinct told him this warehouse was part of the same story that began in 1990, and if it was still active, then someone had a reason to keep its secrets alive. As he drove away, the image of the case stayed with him. 19 years after Elaine vanished, pieces of her life were still being moved in silence, hidden in places just far enough from the public eye. The question was no longer who took her, but how many people had helped keep her gone. That night, the motel room felt smaller than usual, the air heavy, with the scent of stale carpet and chlorine drifting in from the pool outside. Mark sat at the small table, the glow of his laptop casting a pale light across his notes. He began searching through old aviation records, focusing on Skylink's final years and any documented connection between Kerr and cargo operations out of the Amarillo area. After nearly an hour of dead ends, he found something buried in a 1991 federal investigation summary. Skylink had been flagged for possible customs violations after a chartered flight landed with undeclared cargo. The report didn't name Kerr directly, but the tail number matched a plane registered to him at the time. No charges had been filed, but the case had been quietly closed after a lack of cooperation from witnesses. Mark's fingers tapped the keyboard, pulling up every archived newspaper article he could find from the same period. One caught his attention, a small piece in the Amarillo Chronicle from June 1990, mentioning a late-night disturbance at the municipal airfield. Witnesses had reported hearing raised voices inside the Skylink hangar, followed by the sound of an aircraft engine starting. The article named no individuals, but the date stopped Mark cold. It was 2 nights before Elaine Warren was last seen. He sat back in his chair, the hum of the air conditioner filling the room. The sequence was beginning to take shape. If Elaine had been in that hangar, possibly confronting Kerr about something, and a flight had left under suspicious circumstances, then the timing was no coincidence. Whatever was in that cargo, whatever she might have discovered, could have made her a threat. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Harris. Working on the warrant. Warehouse ownership traced to a shell company dissolved in '97. Keep your head down. Mark stared at the message. The shell company detail fit too neatly into the pattern. Whoever owned that warehouse now had made sure their name never touched paper. That kind of secrecy required money, influence, and a reason to keep people like Mark from getting too close. He closed the laptop, but sleep was out of the question. The night Elaine vanished was beginning to look less like a random tragedy and more like a calculated move in a larger operation, one that had been quietly running long after she was gone. The following morning, Mark returned to the airport where Elaine had last been seen alive. Time had changed the place, but not so much that its bones were unrecognizable. The old terminal still stood, though now it served mostly as storage for maintenance equipment. He walked through the cracked sliding doors, their once clear glass now clouded with years of dust. The smell of aged carpet and stale air lingered, a faint echo of the bustling days when passengers streamed through with tickets in hand. An elderly maintenance worker appeared from one of the back rooms, wiping his hands on a rag. Mark introduced himself and explained why he was there. The man's name was Carl, and when Elaine's name came up, his expression turned thoughtful. "Yeah, I remember her. Always wore that red uniform like it was brand new, even on long days. Polite, but she had this determination in her eyes, like she saw through people." Carl leaned on his mop handle, lowering his voice. "The night she disappeared, I was closing up the terminal. I saw her outside the hangar with Kerr. She wasn't smiling. She was holding something, a folder, I think, and Kerr kept glancing around like he didn't want anyone to see them. A few minutes later, the hangar doors shut, and I heard an engine start. By the time I finished locking up, both of them were gone." Mark felt the weight of the detail settle in his mind. A folder. It could have been anything: flight logs, cargo manifests, or something even more incriminating. If Elaine had confronted Kerr with it, she might have sealed her fate. Carl admitted he had never told the police. Back then, people knew better than to get involved. Kerr had friends in high places. And me? I needed to keep my job. Mark thanked him and stepped back into the daylight. The airfield stretched out in front of him, quiet now except for the occasional distant roar of a departing plane. He tried to picture Elaine walking across that tarmac for the last time, folder in hand, unaware that the meeting she was heading into would be the end of her story, or at least the part of it anyone had been allowed to hear. The folder was a missing piece, and if it still existed, it might be the only thing left that could force the truth into the open. Mark drove away from the airport with the image of the folder burned into his thoughts. If Elaine had been carrying documents that night, there was a chance someone had gone to great lengths to hide or destroy them. Still, in his experience, things like that had a way of leaving traces, receipts, carbon copies, or even forgotten duplicates buried in dusty storage rooms. His first stop was the county records office, a squat brick building tucked behind the courthouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. He spent hours combing through archived manifests, customs filings, and maintenance logs from Skylink's final years. Most of the entries were routine, the kind of paperwork that blended into the background of everyday operations. But then he found something odd. On June 12, 1992 days before Elaine vanished, a late-night cargo flight had been logged without a listed manifest. The entry simply read, "Special Consignment," and bore Kerr's signature. Mark flipped through the binder, checking other flights from that month, but none of them had that phrase. The handwriting was rushed, almost as if Kerr hadn't wanted to linger on the page. He copied the details and took them to the back office where an older clerk named Marlene worked. She adjusted her glasses and squinted at the page. "Special consignment," she murmured. That was Kerr's way of saying it was off the books. We all knew what it meant, but no one questioned it. Not if you wanted to keep your job. Mark asked if she had ever seen Elaine handle any of these shipments. Marlene hesitated before nodding. Once or twice. She wasn't supposed to be in the cargo hangar, but she'd show up when things didn't add up. That girl had a way of making people nervous. The detail fit too well with what Carl had told him. If Elaine had stumbled across something tied to that June 12 flight, she might have documented it herself, which could explain the folder she carried. As Mark left the building, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse lawn. The special consignment was more than just a line in a logbook. It was a moment in time, one that might have set the events of Elaine's final hours into motion. All he needed now was to find out what that cargo really was, and who it was worth killing to protect. Mark's next step was to track down anyone who had worked the night shift at the hangar in June 1990. Most of the names he found in old payroll records had long since moved on, but one stood out: a man named Bill Keaton, listed as a ground crew supervisor. According to a quick search, Keaton now lived in a small town an hour north. The drive took him through miles of open farmland, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. When he reached Keaton's address, he found a modest ranch house with a wide front porch and a pair of worn rocking chairs. A wiry man in his late 60s stepped outside before Mark could even knock. "You're not selling anything," Keaton said, narrowing his eyes. "So you must be here about something else." Mark introduced himself and explained he was investigating Elaine Warren's disappearance. Keaton's expression tightened at the name, but he didn't turn him away. They sat on the porch as the wind rustled through the dry grass. That night, June 12th, Keaton began slowly. "Wasn't like the others. We were told to clear the hangar early. No questions. Kerr had a couple of men with him I'd never seen before, and they kept to the shadows. We loaded a few crates onto a jet-light cargo, no markings, and then Kerr told us all to go home, said he'd lock up himself. That never happened before." Mark leaned forward. "Did you see Elaine?" Keaton's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Briefly. She came in through the side door after we were done loading. She looked determined, like she knew exactly what she was walking into. I didn't stick around to find out what happened next." Mark asked why he hadn't come forward. Keaton gave a humorless laugh. "You think anyone back then would have believed me over Kerr? People who crossed him had a way of disappearing. I had a family to think about." The admission carried the weight of old fear. As Mark drove away, the details replayed in his mind: the unmarked crates, the men in the shadows, and Elaine stepping into the hangar with purpose. She hadn't been a victim of chance. She had gone there knowing something, and whatever she found that night had been dangerous enough to keep buried for 19 years. Mark spent the next 2 days digging into cargo records for June of 1990, widening his search beyond county files. He drove to a regional shipping office that had once handled air freight contracts for Skylink, hoping their archives might still hold something. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his 40s with a coffee stain on his shirt, looked skeptical until Mark slid an old photo of Elaine across the desk. "You're talking about that missing flight attendant," the man said, his voice dropping. "I was a kid back then, but I remember my dad mentioning her. He worked in logistics. Said she was the only person who ever made Kerr nervous." After some convincing, the clerk led Mark into a cramped back room where metal filing cabinets stood in uneven rows. Dust coated everything. They found a binder labeled "Special Freight, 1990" in fading marker. Most of the pages were ordinary, but one stood out. It was a shipping invoice from June 12, marked "Private Consignment, Hand Delivery Only." The recipient's name was blacked out in thick ink, but the origin matched the hangar where Elaine had last been seen. Mark ran his fingers over the page. The weight of it felt almost physical. If Elaine had been carrying a folder that night, this could have been part of it. Whoever received that cargo had been important enough to warrant secrecy, and dangerous enough to keep it hidden nearly 2 decades. The clerk glanced at the invoice, then at Mark. "If you're smart, you'll leave it alone. People tied to that shipment, they didn't like questions." Mark copied the page anyway, thanking the clerk before heading back to his car. The parking lot felt too quiet, the air too still. He had the distinct sense of being watched, though he saw no one. Back in his motel room, he laid the copy beside his growing stack of notes. Each piece Carl's memory of the folder, Keaton's account of the unmarked crates, and now the invoice fit together like corners of a puzzle. Somewhere in the middle was Elaine, standing in that hangar on the last night of her life, holding the truth in her hands. And someone had made sure that truth never saw daylight. That evening, Mark spread his notes across the small motel bed, the paper edges curling from the weight of handling. The invoice sat at the center, its blacked-out recipient glaring at him like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete smile. He kept going back to the phrase, "hand delivery only." In shipping terms, it was unusual. In Kerr's world, it sounded like a shield, something meant to keep curious eyes away. He decided to call Harris and relay what he had found. The detective's voice was low, careful, as if someone might be listening. Harris told him the warrant for the warehouse was still tied up in legal delays. "But your invoice," Harris said, "that might give us leverage. If we can match it to other shipments, we can start to pull threads." Mark agreed to meet him the next morning, but after they hung up, Sleep refused to come. He kept picturing Elaine in her bright red uniform, standing under the harsh hangar lights, holding that folder. She would have known the risks. She had seen the kind of men Kerr kept around him, the way he worked in shadows. Whatever was in that shipment, she must have thought it was worth confronting him over. At midnight, Mark drove back to the industrial district. He parked a block from the warehouse and sat in the dark, watching the building's side entrance. After nearly an hour, a figure emerged, a man in a dark jacket, carrying what looked like a narrow case. He loaded it into the back of an old panel van, then drove off without headlights until he reached the street. Mark considered following, but knew it would be reckless. Without backup, he would be exposing himself to the same danger Elaine had faced. Instead, he wrote down the plate number and the time, his pen scratching quickly over the paper. The details were small, but small details had a way of breaking cases open. As he drove back to the motel, the streets empty around him, he felt the first glimmer of certainty. This wasn't just a cold case buried under dust. Someone was still moving pieces, still protecting whatever had been hidden in that hangar 19 years ago. And that meant the trail to Elaine was still warm. The next morning, Mark met Harris at a small diner off the highway. The place smelled of bacon grease and strong coffee, and a low hum of conversation filled the air. Harris slid into the booth across from him, glancing briefly at the folder Mark had brought. Mark handed over the copied invoice and the plate number from the van. Harris studied the paper, his brow furrowing. This plate is registered to a shell company dissolved years ago. Whoever's running that warehouse is covering their tracks well. He set the paper down and leaned in. You said the man carried a narrow case. Could have been tools, but it could have been something else. Any markings? Mark shook his head. Too dark. But he moved like it mattered, like it was worth more than it looked. Harris tapped his fingers against the table, thinking, I'll put a tail on the van, see where it leads. In the meantime, keep digging into Skylink's old roots. That shipment didn't start here, and it didn't end here. Someone paid to keep it quiet, and that kind of money leaves a trail. Mark sipped his coffee, the bitterness cutting through the restless fatigue that had settled in his bones. He found himself imagining Elaine seated across from him instead of Harris, her red uniform neat, her eyes sharp and steady. He wondered if she had ever tried to tell someone what she'd seen, only to be met with the same silence that had shrouded the town for nearly 2 decades. When Harris left, Mark lingered at the table, making a list of everyone still alive who had worked for Kerr in 1990. Most were scattered across the state now, some retired, others running small businesses. But one name jumped out: Frank Delaney, a former cargo handler who had abruptly left Skylink a week after Elaine vanished. His last known address was less than 30 miles away. Mark folded the list into his pocket and headed for the door. The morning light was harsh and bright, and for a moment he felt the weight of what was coming. Each person he tracked down was another door that could either open to the truth or slam shut with dangerous finality. He had no way of knowing which one Delaney would choose. Frank Delaney lived in a sagging 2-story house at the edge of a forgotten neighborhood where weeds pushed through cracked sidewalks and mailboxes leaned on rusted posts. Mark parked across the street and watched for a moment. The curtains in the front window were drawn, but a faint glow of television light pulsed behind them. When Mark knocked, it took nearly a full minute before the door creaked open. Delaney appeared, thinner than his payroll photo from 1990, his eyes sunken and wary. He wore a flannel shirt with one sleeve torn at the cuff, and his voice carried the rasp of too many years spent smoking. "I'm not buying anything," Delaney muttered. "I'm here about Elaine Warren," Mark said, keeping his tone steady. Something flickered in Delaney's gaze recognition. Maybe guilt, but he didn't close the door. After a pause, he stepped back and motioned for Mark to come inside. The living room smelled faintly of dust and stale beer, the coffee table cluttered with old newspapers and unopened mail. Delaney sank into an armchair and rubbed his face. "I shouldn't talk about this," he began. "Back then, I saw things I shouldn't have. People got hurt for less." Mark waited, letting the silence press him forward. Finally, Delaney spoke again. "That shipment on June 12th, it wasn't standard cargo. We were told not to open the crates, but one of them cracked during loading. I saw what was inside: stacks of sealed envelopes, bundles of cash, foreign bills I didn't recognize. Kerr caught me looking. He didn't say a word, but the next day I was reassigned to inventory. A week later, Elaine was gone. Mark asked if Elaine had seen inside the crate too. Delaney nodded slowly. She was there that night, walked right up to it before Kerr could stop her. She asked him point blank what was going on. He told her it was none of her business. That was the last time I saw her. The weight of the confession settled in the room. Delaney looked toward the window, as if expecting someone to be watching. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, his voice low. Mark left the house knowing one thing for certain: Elaine hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had uncovered something worth killing for, and the people who profited from it had never stopped protecting their secret. Mark drove away from Delaney's house with the old man's words echoing in his mind. Bundles of foreign cash, sealed envelopes, a confrontation in the hangar that no one in authority had ever acknowledged. It made the discovery of Elaine's uniform feel less like a forgotten relic and more like a warning deliberately placed to surface at the right moment. He stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town to gather his thoughts. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the cracked pavement. As he filled the tank, a blue sedan rolled past slowly, its driver glancing his way just long enough to make his chest tighten. He told himself it could be nothing, but his instincts refused to let it go. Back in the car, he called Harris to relay what Delaney had said. The detective's reaction was terse. "That confirms part of what I've been hearing through unofficial channels. Kerr was suspected of laundering money for people overseas. If Elaine saw inside that crate, she became a liability." Mark asked if the discovery of the uniform could have been a signal from someone on the inside. Harris didn't answer immediately. "It's possible. But if that's true, then whoever left it there is playing a dangerous game. You need to watch yourself. If they know you're asking questions, you could be next on their list." The warning didn't surprise him. He had felt eyes on him for days. Still, the idea that someone connected to Elaine's last night might be trying to guide him forward shifted the ground beneath his investigation. It meant the past wasn't entirely sealed away. There were cracks in it, and through those cracks, light was still leaking out. That night, Mark spread his growing collection of evidence across the motel desk. The invoice, the plate number, Delaney's testimony. Every piece circled back to June 12, 1990, and the unmarked crates that passed through the hangar under Kerr's watch. Elaine had seen something inside one of them, and less than an hour later, she was gone. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faded photograph of her in her red uniform. Somewhere, someone else knew the truth of that night, and they had just left him a trail bold enough for him to find, but subtle enough to avoid being traced. The following morning, Mark decided to retrace Elaine's final known steps. He drove to the small regional airport where she had last signed in for duty on the day she disappeared. The terminal had changed over the years, but the hangar district still looked frozen in time, rows of corrugated metal buildings standing against the wind with chipped paint and rust creeping up their seams. He found the old Skylink hangar sealed behind a heavy chain and padlock. Through a narrow gap in the side wall, he could see the dusty outline of crates stacked along the far wall, their shapes softened by years of neglect. Something about the arrangement bothered him. A clear path ran from the center of the floor to a small door at the back, as if someone had deliberately left access to whatever lay beyond. Mark circled the building and found the rear door boarded over. A faded "No Trespassing" sign flapped weakly against the wood. He crouched to peer through a splintered gap and caught sight of a metal shelf leaning against the wall. On it sat a weathered cardboard box, the kind used for shipping documents, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a small, recent smear where fingers had brushed it clean. The sound of footsteps on gravel snapped him back to the present. He turned to see a man in a faded ball cap approaching, his expression unreadable. "You looking for something?" the man asked, his voice calm but edged with caution. Mark introduced himself as a journalist, researching old aviation cases. The man studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the boarded door. "That place has ghosts. People around here know better than to mess with it." Without another word, he walked off, disappearing between the hangars. Back in his car, Mark noted the encounter in his journal. Whoever the man was, he knew something about the hangar's history, maybe even about Elaine. The smeared dust on the box inside suggested the building wasn't as abandoned as it looked. As the airport's runways stretched into the distance, Mark felt a pulse of certainty. Elaine's story wasn't just about a missing flight attendant. It was about the cargo that passed through this place, the people who profited from it, and the one woman who had dared to look too closely. That evening, Mark traced the registration of the hangar and discovered it hadn't belonged to Skylink for over a decade. On paper, it was now owned by a freight company that had never actually operated flights out of the airport. The address for their headquarters led to a vacant lot in another state. It was a shell, just like the company tied to the van. He called Harris to share the finding, and the detective's voice sharpened. That freight company shows up in a few cases involving smuggling through secondary airfields. Nothing proven, but enough to make them interesting. If your hangars under their name, we're not just dealing with old payroll disputes. Mark thought of Elaine again, picturing her walking through that very hangar 19 years ago, her heels tapping across the concrete, her eyes landing on something she wasn't meant to see. Whatever she had stumbled into, it had been big enough to silence her completely. Determined to learn more, he visited the airport's operations office the next morning and requested access to public maintenance logs. The clerk was reluctant until Mark flashed his press credentials, explaining he was working on a historical feature about the airport's role in regional air travel. After a long wait, she returned with a binder thick with records. Leafing through the entries for June 1990, he found one that stood out. A notation indicated a special clearance granted for Hangar 6 on the night of Elaine's disappearance. The request had bypassed normal scheduling channels and been signed by someone who no longer worked at the airport. Mark copied the page and slipped it into his folder. Special clearance meant someone had the authority to lock down the hangar without raising questions. It also meant there was likely a record of what aircraft came and went that night. Driving back toward the motel, Mark felt the threads pulling tighter. He now had the hangar's current shadow owner, an unexplained clearance on the night Elaine vanished, and a chain of shell companies linking back to suspected smuggling. The only missing link was the proof that tied Elaine directly to that shipment and whatever it contained that made her disappear before she could ever tell the world what she had found. Mark knew the clearance log was a door, but he needed the key to push it open. That key lay in the airport's long-term storage archives, where flight manifests and tower logs from decades past gathered dust. Officially, those records were off-limits without a court order, but unofficially, Harris had hinted that there were still people in the system who disliked what had happened all those years ago. Through a quiet favor, Mark found himself in a dimly lit records room beneath the control tower the next afternoon. The air was heavy with the scent of paper and stale air, and the only sound was the hum of an old ceiling fan. Row after row of cardboard boxes lined the shelves, each marked with a range of dates. He worked his way to the June 1990 section and began leafing through yellowed log sheets. It took nearly an hour, but there it was, a record of a Gulfstream jet arriving just before midnight on the 12th, logged under a charter service that had no prior history at the airport. No passengers were listed, only priority cargo with the clearance code matching the hangar log. More unsettling was the notation that the aircraft departed less than 20 minutes after landing, headed for a private strip in the Caribbean. Mark's pulse quickened. That kind of turnaround was nearly impossible without meticulous preloading, which meant the shipment was already in the hangar before the plane touched down. It fit Delaney's story too well. Elaine had been there during loading. She had seen what was inside. As Mark copied the relevant entries, a soft creak came from somewhere behind him. He turned quickly, but the aisle was empty. Still, a faint scuffing sound echoed from the far end of the room, fading into silence. He finished his work quickly, slipping the copied pages into his folder and exiting with a calm he didn't feel. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain from the horizon. He scanned the parking lot before getting into his car, half expecting to see the blue sedan again. It wasn't there, but the uneasy feeling remained. Whoever had been in that records room with him wasn't a clerk coming for old paperwork. Someone else was following the same trail, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous that trail was becoming. Rain began to fall as Mark pulled into the motel lot, the kind of steady, soaking rain that turned everything gray and blurred the edges of the world. Inside his room, he spread the copied records across the bed, the pages curling slightly from the damp air. The Gulfstream's brief stop, the special clearance code, and the shell company owner of the hangar all pointed to a single conclusion. Elaine hadn't vanished in some random act of violence. She had been caught in the middle of an organized operation, one with the resources to erase her and bury the evidence for nearly 2 decades. He thought again about the uniform found in the hangar. 19 years later, it was too deliberate, too clean to have been left by accident. It felt more like a message, and the more he studied the sequence of events, the more convinced he became that someone from that night was still out there, quietly pulling him toward the truth. Mark called Harris and read the details from the flight log. Harris listened without interrupting, but when Mark finished, his voice was low and tense. "That private strip in the Caribbean? It's been linked to at least 3 federal investigations, all shut down before charges could stick. If Elaine knew that was the destination, she wouldn't have stayed silent." The thought hung in the air between them. Silence, for Elaine, had never been an option. If she had tried to tell someone, it meant someone close to her might have been the one to stop her. A sharp knock at the door pulled Mark from his thoughts. He approached cautiously and peered through the curtain. A small envelope lay on the doormat, its surface speckled with rain. He opened the door, grabbed it, and scanned the parking lot. No one was there. Inside, he tore the envelope open. A single photograph slid out, its edges warped with age. It showed the hangar floor, crates stacked high, and in the corner, barely visible, Elaine in her red uniform, turning toward the camera with a startled expression. Mark's hands tightened around the photo. Whoever had left it knew he was here, knew what he was looking for, and had just handed him proof that Elaine had been in that hangar on the night she disappeared. Mark stared at the photograph for a long time, the room silent except for the rain drumming against the window. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking Elaine. The tilt of her head, the way her hand was mid-motion, as if she had just been interrupted, and that flicker of unease in her eyes told him she had been caught off guard. Whoever took this picture had been close enough to capture her without her knowledge, and close enough to know what was happening in that hangar. He placed the photo beside the flight log, the hangar clearance record, and the ownership papers. Together, they formed a fragile but undeniable thread. Elaine had been present during the loading of that shipment, and someone had documented it. That meant there was a witness, maybe even more than one. The question was whether that person was still alive or still willing to talk. The envelope itself held another clue. In the corner, faint but visible, was a return address printed in blocky type. It led to a P.O. box in a neighboring county, an area Mark knew was home to several retired airport staff. He decided to drive there the next morning, hoping to find someone willing to admit they had sent it. Before turning in for the night, he called Harris and described the photo. The detective's response was sharp. "That image changes everything. If it's authentic, it puts her inside the hangar minutes before she disappeared. We can use that." But then Harris added something that made Mark's skin prickle. "Be careful. Whoever sent it is taking a risk, but so are you. That picture was never meant to survive." Sleep came in fits, his mind replaying the scene in the photograph. He imagined Elaine's voice, the confidence in it, and the way she might have confronted whoever was in charge that night. But the vision always ended the same way, her turning toward the camera, eyes wide, and then darkness. By morning the rain had stopped, leaving the motel lot washed clean under a pale sun. Mark packed the photograph and the envelope into his bag, feeling the weight of what they meant. Somewhere in that other county, the person who had been holding on to this secret for 19 years was waiting, and with them, the final pieces of what happened to Elaine. The post office in the neighboring county was small, the kind of place where the same clerk had probably worked the counter for decades. Mark approached with the envelope in hand, his pulse steady but quick. When he asked about the P.O. box, the clerk hesitated, eyeing him carefully before disappearing into the back. Moments later, a man emerged from a side door, his shoulders stooped, but his gaze sharp. "You're the one looking into Elaine Warren," the man said quietly. His voice was rough, but there was no hostility in it, only weariness. He introduced himself as Frank Delaney, a former maintenance worker at the airport. In a back corner of the post office, away from the few customers, Frank told him that on the night Elaine vanished, he had been ordered to keep the hangar lights off and stay outside while a special shipment was loaded. Curiosity got the better of him, and he had slipped inside, hiding behind a stack of crates. What he saw, he said, had never left him. Elaine entered mid-loading, her voice carrying across the space as she demanded to know why the shipment was unscheduled. A man in a dark jacket intercepted her, speaking low but firmly. She shook her head, turned to leave, and that was when Frank snapped the picture. Before he could move again, another worker spotted him, forcing him to flee into the rain. By the next morning, Elaine was gone. Frank admitted he had kept the photo all these years, unsure who to trust. "Too many people had ties to that shipment," he said. "I figured if I ever saw someone serious about finding her, I'd pass it along." Mark felt the weight of the words and the gravity of the moment. With the photograph, the flight records, and Frank's eyewitness account, there was finally a path to the truth. Harris later confirmed the evidence was enough to reopen the case, and a federal investigation began peeling back the layers of the old smuggling network. As Mark left the county that evening, the sun was setting over the flat stretch of highway, bathing everything in gold. He thought of Elaine not just as a headline or a missing person, but as someone who had stood her ground when it mattered most. 19 years later, her voice was finally being heard.